Good news, everybody. Today's video is sponsored by Bright Cellars, who provide one of the greatest services of any sponsor on YouTube. They send wine to your house. There's not much that beats that. So look, if you're like me, you probably like discovering new wine to drink and enjoy, and that's precisely what Bright Cellars does so well for you. They scour the globe looking for hidden gems across many of the small vineyards that lie in the Italian countryside or the South American islands. And Bright Cellars maximizes the chances that you're going to love the wine they send you by providing you with a super short 7-question quiz about what you like. No snobbery, it's all very accessible, and they show you a list of wines from around the world that you're most likely to enjoy based on your responses. When you're done, Bright Cellars sends you your wine with a guarantee that you'll like them, and if you don't, they'll ship you another bottle with your next delivery. You really can't lose. And what else? Well, you can choose how much they send, and of course, it's all delivered to wherever you want it to go, making everything super easy. Each box is recyclable with a low footprint and features wine education cards, so you can even learn a bit about what you're drinking, like how you might correctly pair it with foods or what temperature it's best served at. They'll also occasionally do little flash sales that are very cool. For instance, they recently emailed about a broken label sale where you can grab 12 bottles of wine at a ridiculously low price, all because the labels had accidentally ripped off or been marked or something. Great wine, still, but it's at an awesome price. Right now, Bright Cellars is giving you guys 50% off your first 6-bottle box. That's just $55 for 6 great bottles, which is a crazy good deal. Just follow the link in the description below and get started today. And now today's video. If you ever worked in an office, chances are at some point you've had to interact with that co-worker. You know the one, miserable, antisocial, constantly grumbling about every minor inconvenience. The one who never takes lunch with the rest of the staff, is constantly late or underperforming, and responds to even the most reasonable requests with barely contained rage. If so, then you probably joked about that said co-worker being only one bad day away from walking into the office with a gun and shooting the place up. In other words, going postal. While in the United States and elsewhere, going postal has become synonymous with sudden, often lethal bouts of workplace violence, with few questioning the origin of the term, this phrase didn't come out of nowhere. Starting in 1970, United States Postal Service employees committed a string of horrific workplace shootings, leaving 60 people dead and dozens more injured, and forever changing the popular perception of postal workers. Mass shootings involving postal workers have been recorded since the 1960s, the most high-profile being the infamous Son of Sam killings. Between December 1975 and August 1977, USPS letter sorter David Berkowitz killed 6 people and wounded 9 in New York City before being arrested. During his trial, Berkowitz claimed to have acted on the instructions of a demon which had taken the form of a dog owned by a neighbor named Sam. However, the first incident to truly cement the link between postal workers and violence in the minds of the American people would not take place until August the 20th, 1986. Patrick Sherrill, a 45-year-old letter carrier for the Edmond, Oklahoma post office, was the very model of a toxic employee. Known to his co-workers and neighbors as Crazy Pat, Sherrill had a long history of bizarre and unsettling behavior, such as wandering around his Oklahoma City neighborhood, peering into windows, making obscene phone calls to neighbors, and tying up stray dogs and cats in his backyard with baling wire. An inveterate loner, Sherrill never had any close friends or romantic interests, and could not hold down steady employment, drifting between various menial jobs before joining the United States Marine Corps in 1963. Here, Sherrill found his one and only calling: shooting. A skilled marksman, Sherrill trained to become a Marine sharpshooter before being honorably discharged in 1966. Despite his frequent claims to have fought in Vietnam, Sherrill in fact never left US soil during his service. In 1984, Sherrill would join the Oklahoma National Guard, becoming a shooting instructor and competing on the marksmanship team. But in the meantime, civilian life did not seem to agree with Sherrill, and following the death of his mother in 1974, he became increasingly withdrawn and unstable. He became obsessed with amateur radio, packing his house floor to ceiling with electronic equipment as well as guns, ammunition, and military and pornographic magazines. His roof soon sprouted 4 large antennas, while his backyard filled with rusty junk. Sherrill's conduct at work was even worse. One co-worker, a civilian employee at the National Guard, refused to be alone with him, claiming the way he stared at her made her feel naked, and that, quote, he looked like someone who peeped in windows and molested little kids. During a brief stint at the Federal Aviation Administration, Sherrill received numerous complaints for leering at or rubbing against female co-workers and was ultimately fired for cornering a woman in an elevator. In 1985, Sherrill landed a position as a part-time relief carrier for the Edmond Post Office. This hourly position did not come with the same job security or benefits enjoyed by his full-time salaried colleagues, a fact which greatly angered Sherrill. As before, Sherrill proved a poor and toxic employee, avoiding and making frequent snide comments towards his co-workers and constantly being reprimanded for tardiness, misdirecting mail, and being rude towards customers, and on one occasion, macing a dog that was safely behind a fence. Sherrill came to believe he was being deliberately targeted by his supervisors and vowed to take revenge. On August the 20th, 1986, having received another formal reprimand, Sherrill finally made good on his threat. That morning at 7 a.m., Sherrill reported to work as usual, dressed in his blue post office uniform and carrying his mail bag. But inside the bag were not letters, but 2 National Guard issued 45 caliber pistols, a 22 caliber pistol, and piles of ammunition. After locking the doors to prevent anyone from escaping, Sherrill stormed into the office of his supervisor, Rick Esser, and shot him in the chest, killing him instantly. Sherrill had also intended to kill Bill Bland, another supervisor, but miraculously, Bland had overslept that morning and did not arrive at work until Sherrill's rampage had ended. Instead, Sherrill shot full-time letter carrier Mike Rockney, who was in Esser's office requesting time off. At first, Sherrill's co-workers elsewhere in the building thought someone was setting off firecrackers. That was, however, until Sherrill started striding through the building, shooting anyone who tried to flee and locking the rest of the exits. One employee managed to escape the building, only to bleed out in the parking lot. With everyone now trapped inside, Sherrill swept once again through the office, gunning down anyone that he found hiding in cubicles or under tables. Meanwhile, the police arrived in the parking lot and tried to contact Sherrill via telephone and bullhorn. There was no reply. Then, at 8:30 a.m., an hour and a half after Sherrill began his rampage, a SWAT team stormed the building. They found a scene of absolute horror, with bloody, bullet-riddled bodies strewn about the office. Among them was that of Patrick Sherrill, who had retreated back to Rick Esser's office and shot himself in the head. In all, Sherrill had wounded 6 people and killed 15, including himself. The next morning, the surviving post office employees returned to work to find the floors newly mopped and waxed and the bullet holes in the walls patched over and painted, as if nothing had ever happened. The only signs of the tragedy that had unfolded the day before were the empty cubicles and the flowers left outside the building by sympathetic citizens. Meanwhile, the Edmond Postal massacre shook the nation to its very core. While there had been mass shootings before, most notably on the 1st of August 1966, when former Marine sharpshooter Charles Whitman climbed a clock tower at the University of Texas in Austin and gunned down 14 people at random, Patrick Sherrill added a new dimension to senseless violence. He brought it into the workplace, suddenly making everyone extremely wary of their disgruntled co-workers. But while Sherrill's rampage was, and remains, the worst workplace massacre in US history, it was far from the last. Over the next decade, many more postal workers would take out their grievances in equally horrific ways. Much like Patrick Sherrill, 34-year-old Joseph Harris of Ridgewood, New Jersey, had a history of unsettling behavior. Described by his co-workers as quiet, tense, and odd, Harris was obsessed with weapons and the military, and was often observed walking around like some karate guy, chopping his hands in the air. A mediocre worker who responded poorly to authority, Harris frequently clashed with his supervisor, Carol Ott. This feud reached its peak in April 1991 when Ott filed a report with the police accusing Harris of harassing her on the job. Ott then ordered Harris to submit to a fitness of duty exam. Harris refused and was subsequently fired. On his way out of the office, co-workers heard Harris growl to Ott, "I'm going to get you." While many of us have said, or at least thought similar things about our bosses, Harris actually made good on his threat. Just after midnight on October the 10th, 1991, Harris donned black military-style fatigues, combat boots, a bulletproof vest, a black ninja-style hood, and a gas mask, and armed himself with a 9mm Uzi submachine gun, a 22 caliber handgun fitted with a suppressor, 3 hand grenades, some homemade pipe bombs, and a Japanese katana sword. After writing a 2-page manifesto alleging unfair treatment by the US Postal Service and booby-trapping his house with explosives, he made his way to Carol Ott's apartment in Wayne, New Jersey, forced his way inside, and slashed at her with his sword, killing her instantly. He then made his way downstairs where Ott's boyfriend, Cornelius Carsten, was watching television and executed him with a pistol shot behind the ear. But while Harris had succeeded in killing who he saw as his main tormentor, it wasn't finished yet. His grievance lay with the entire postal service. From Ott's apartment, Harris made his way to his former workplace where he shot and killed mail handlers Joseph Van der Pauw and Donald McNaught. These killings were witnessed by a passing truck driver who approached the post office to investigate. Harris opened fire, but the driver managed to escape and contact the police. Officers arrived on the scene within minutes, but were forced to retreat when Harris lobbed several pipe bombs at them. But Harris was surrounded with nowhere to flee, and after only half an hour of negotiations, he agreed to give himself up. In the course of the subsequent investigation, the police discovered that Harris was also responsible for a brutal unsolved murder committed 3 years earlier. In 1988, Harris discovered that he had lost $10,000 due to shady investment broker Roy Edwards. Seeking revenge, on November the 16th of that year, Harris broke into the Edwards home in Montville, New Jersey, fatally shot Roy and raped his wife and 2 daughters. Given the emotional nature of both crimes, during the trial, Harris's lawyers attempted to argue their client was not guilty by reason of insanity. The jury, however, was not convinced, and in May 1993, Harris was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Numerous appeals for clemency were denied, but in the end, Harris never faced the gallows, dying in prison of natural causes in 1996. The same year as Harris's spree, another recently dismissed postal worker, 31-year-old Thomas McIlvaine, stormed into the post office in Royal Oak, Michigan, with a sawed-off .22 caliber rifle and opened fire, wounding 4 people and killing 5, including himself. But the peak of the postal shooting epidemic would come 2 years later, when in a strange coincidence, 2 massacres nearly 3,000 kilometers apart took place within hours of each other. The first took place in Dearborn, Michigan, where post office mechanic Lawrence Jason, having recently been passed over for promotion, shot 3 people, 1 fatally, in a USPS garage before turning the gun on himself. In the second, former letter carrier Mark Hilburn of Dana Point, California, killed his mother and her dog before storming into the local post office and shooting 2 postal workers, killing 1. Hilburn, who was later arrested, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment, had recently been dismissed from USPS for stalking a co-worker. While not the first high-profile postal shootings, the 1993 incidents have the distinction of adding a new idiom to the American vernacular, which first appeared almost simultaneously in 2 different newspapers. On December 17, 1993, the Florida paper, the St. Petersburg Times, wrote, "The symposium was sponsored by the U.S. Postal Service, which has seen so many outbursts that in some circles excessive stress is known as going postal. 35 people have been killed in 11 post office shootings since 1983. While on December 31st, the Los Angeles Times said, "Unlike the more deadly mass shootings around the nation, which have lent a new term to the language, referring to shooting up the office as going postal." The phrase going postal immediately became synonymous with deadly workplace violence, the cliché of a disgruntled postal worker snapping and shooting up their workplace becoming a staple of late-night comedy routines, popping up as a punchline in movies and TV shows such as The Naked Gun, Jumanji, and Seinfeld, and even forming the central premise of the controversial Postal series of video games. Unsurprisingly, the United States Postal Service was less than enthusiastic about being associated with mass murder. The St. Petersburg Times article went on to state, "The USPS does not approve of the term going postal and has made attempts to stop people from using the saying. Some postal workers, however, feel it has earned its place." Indeed, there seemed to be no end to post office-related violence. In 2003, Jennifer San Marco, a postal employee from Goleta, California, was forced to retire due to worsening mental health issues. On January 30th, 2006, San Marco shot a resident of a condominium before making her way to the Goleta Postal Processing Center and killing 7 people, including herself. This was the deadliest massacre in U.S. history committed by a woman. That same year, Grant Gallagher, a disgruntled post office employee from Baker City, Oregon, arrived at work armed with a .357 Magnum revolver, intending to kill his postmaster. Arriving in the parking lot, Gallagher spotted his supervisor, Lori Hayes Cotter, and proceeded to run her over several times with his vehicle before entering the building in search of postmaster Michael McGuire. Unable to find him, Gallagher instead returned to the parking lot and shot Cotter dead. Gallagher later testified that he resented the extra workload recently placed on him. On December 23rd, 2017, postal worker Deshaun Stewart of Dublin, Ohio, arrived at work naked and fatally shot his supervisor, Lance Herrera Dempsey. He then made his way to a nearby apartment complex and killed the Dublin postmaster, Ginger Ballard, by throwing her to the ground headfirst. Stewart was subsequently arrested and tried for murder, but found not guilty by reason of insanity and was confined to a psychiatric institution. Finally, on April 15th, 2021, 19-year-old Brandon Scott Hole drove into the parking lot of a FedEx ground facility in Indianapolis, Indiana, and opened fire with a rifle, injuring 7 and killing 9, including himself. Hole had just been fired from FedEx for failing to show up to work. The Indianapolis shooting was only the most recently in a long line of post office massacres, which are too numerous to list in their entirety. Between 1970 and 2021, 60 people were killed in 27 rampage killings by current or former post office employees. During the worst years of the epidemic between 1986 and 1997, these shootings took place nearly at a rate of 2 per year, with an average of 11.8 people killed every year. It's important to note here that despite what popular culture would have us believe, studies have shown that postal workers are in fact no more likely to commit acts of workplace violence than workers in other fields, and that equally deadly shootings have occurred in many other industries. Yet, in examining the bloody history of post office shootings, it's hard not to suspect that there is something uniquely stressful about postal work that pushes its practitioners to commit such extreme acts of violence. After all, in the wake of Thomas McIlvain's 1991 Royal Oak Massacre, few of his co-workers expressed surprise, stating that such an incident was a long time coming. Stranger still, upon hearing of the massacre, they reported thinking that the perpetrator could have been just about anyone, indicating a widespread culture of discontent within the post office. Indeed, following the 1986 Edmund Massacre, Vincent Sombretto, president of the National Association of Letter Carriers, made the following public statement. "While we are shocked and dismayed by what happened and offer our prayers to those surviving victims now in the hospital, we cannot help but believe that Mr. Sherrill was pushed over the brink by irresponsible and coercive management policies by the Postal Service in the Oklahoma City region." It was not until after the twin 1993 massacres, however, that the USPS launched a large-scale investigation into the going postal phenomenon, appointing workplace environment analysts to 85 post office districts across the nation to report on working conditions. The analysts' reports revealed that there was indeed something rotten in the state of the post office, and that it all had to do with Reaganomics. The post office is among the United States' most venerable institutions, with the power of Congress to establish and regulate a postal service being enshrined in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 7 of the Constitution. While the Constitution was ratified on June 21, 1788, the Post Office Department was not officially established until February 20th, 1792, with Timothy Pickering as the first Postmaster General. The Founding Fathers saw a well-run post office as key to a robust, functioning democracy, allowing news about national and international affairs as well as electoral ballots to reach every American citizen regardless of location or status. From this beginning, the post office expanded rapidly, and by 1800 there were over 900 post offices and over 20,000 miles of post road across the country. The Post Office Department continued to operate on this model for nearly 200 years, but while it generally succeeded in its stated mission of providing reliable postal services to all citizens, it was far from a perfect system. Being a government department overseen by an appointed member of the cabinet, the post office required an act of Congress in order to make any changes to its operations, such as increasing the price of stamps, authorizing pay raises for its workers, or introducing new products and services. Consequently, the post office was extremely slow to adapt to changing conditions, and by the mid-20th century, most postal workers were overworked, underpaid, and equipped with antiquated, poorly maintained facilities and vehicles. This situation came to a head in 1970 when postal workers in New York City launched an illegal 8-day strike, crippling the U.S. postal system and prompting President Richard Nixon to pass the Postal Reorganization Act. This act dissolved the United States Post Office Department and replaced it with the United States Postal Service, or USPS, a semi-private corporation. The reorganization freed the post office from direct congressional control and guaranteed its workers the right to collective bargaining, though not significantly the right to strike. In exchange, the act required USPS to wean itself off of government subsidies and support its operations entirely through postage and other services by 1985, a feat it accomplished 2 years early in 1983. Despite this, following the election of President Ronald Reagan in 1980, a widespread perception arose of the post office as a bloated, inefficient government bureaucracy, wasting citizens' tax dollars, with neoliberal economists and politicians calling for the organization to be privatized or disbanded entirely. As a result, the post office came under increasing pressure to operate more efficiently and to handle an ever-increasing volume of mail while still independently supporting itself. But there was a problem. Though nominally an independent corporation, the USPS was still overseen by the Postal Regulatory Commission, which had to approve any proposed postal rate increases. It was also still bound by the Constitution to deliver mail to every single American household, no matter how remote. And with an almost fully unionized workforce, mass layoffs were not a viable option. The only solution to this dilemma was for the USPS to squeeze its existing workforce even harder, forcing its employees to work even longer and harder hours. The burden of enforcing these productivity demands typically fell on supervisors and middle managers, fostering toxic and often abusive relationships between workers and management, and a highly stressful workplace culture that government analysts described as a pressure cooker. As a report prepared by the office of Senator Carl Levin of Michigan following the Royal Oak Massacre revealed, the workplace environment exhibited patterns of harassment, intimidation, cruelty, and allegations of favoritism in promotions and demotions, and testimony relating to wide-ranging delivery and service problems. At the same time, the post office was one of the few employers willing to provide middle-class wages with benefits to workers without a college education or trade skill set. And while nearly all postal workers were unionized, abusive supervisors often reprimanded employees who filed grievances and interfered with union operations. Thus, many workers, seeing no recourse and fearful of losing their benefits, chose to suffer in silence. For some, the pressure would prove too much to handle. While numerous General Accounting Office reports had identified these issues long before the 1986 Edmund shooting, for years the USPS chose to turn a blind eye to the problem, with tragic consequences. While the postal killing epidemic of the 1980s and 90s prompted USPS to implement a variety of reforms, such as more stringent screening procedures for new hires and improved workplace health and safety measures, unfortunately many of these reforms have since been clawed back as part of ongoing cost-saving measures. And as the post office and many other businesses continue to struggle in the face of inflation, stagnating wages, economic instability, and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, it is perhaps only a matter of time before yet another worker is pushed beyond their limits and decides to go postal. Thankfully, there's no danger of that over here in YouTube land. After all, it's not like we have to work an ever greater number of hours to put out more and more content to satisfy an increasingly unstable, fickle, and oversaturated market on the whims of an algorithm. Not at all. No danger. Where's my gun? That was a joke, internet world. And not exactly an appropriate one at that.